Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me this evening. What follows is a gentle, quiet story, designed not to stimulate, but to soothe. A peaceful journey into the past, told slowly, with soft details and a calming rhythm to help you unwind. There's no need to focus or stay alert, just allow the words to drift by, like waves on a quiet shore, and let yourself rest. At the edge of a quiet medieval town stood the prison, an old, enduring structure of heavy stone, shaped more by function than beauty. The walls were thick and grey, weathered by countless seasons. Moss crept slowly along the base, and ivy wrapped itself up the sides as though trying to soften the sharpness of the stone. Few people looked directly at it, fewer still spoke of what lay within. It had always been there, like a shadow cast over the edge of town. It was not a grand place. There were no banners or towers of pride. It crouched low against the earth, square and grim, built for containment, not comfort. The stones, once carefully laid, had shifted slightly over time. Rain darkened their surface, and in the winter, frost clung to the mortar. Yet the prison did not change. It remained still, enduring, waiting. Inside, narrow corridors wound through the structure like veins. Torchlight flickered along damp walls, revealing scratches, smears, and the faint prints of old hands. Footsteps echoed when guards passed, though they came infrequently. The silence was rarely broken, and when it was not with shouting, but with hushed movement, the occasional clang of metal or the whisper of wind through cracks in the stone. The cells were sparse and silent. Most were just large enough for a man to lie down, but not stretch fully. The air smelled of earth and iron. A rough bench or pile of straw served as a bed. A small window, high and narrow, allowed in only a sliver of light, enough to suggest that the outside world still turned. Iron rings were fastened into walls and floors, reminders of the purpose of such a place. Shackles lay idle, rusted and worn, but never quite forgotten. The air was cool, heavy with stillness. Rats came and went, as did insects and spiders, but human voices were rare. When they came, they were quiet. Words were rationed, as precious as the bits of bread or sips of water passed through the bars. Prisoners came from many paths. Some were poor, caught stealing out of desperation. Others had angered the wrong man or been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Justice in those days was uneven, its weight shifting with favour, fear, or misunderstanding. But once the door closed, reasons faded. Guilt and innocence mattered little to the stone. In the prison, time moved slowly. There were no clocks or chimes. Days passed without count. Only the subtle shifts in light marked the hours, and even those grew difficult to follow. The outside world, its voices, its laughter, its changing seasons, became distant, like a dream forgotten upon waking. Inside these walls, the prisoner became a still figure among unmoving stone, breathing quietly, waiting without expectation, and learning the rhythm of a life reduced to silence. In the medieval world, arrest was not always loud or sudden. It did not always come with shouts or swords drawn. More often, it came quietly, wrapped in the routine of daily life. A knock at the door, a hand placed on a shoulder in the village square, a quiet word exchanged with a local reeve or guard. The moment of arrest was not marked by drama, but by stillness, a pause in the flow of ordinary time. The reasons for arrest varied: a missing coin, a broken oath, a whispered rumour, or a landowner's grievance could all lead to detainment. There were laws, of course, but they differed from one village to the next, and not all were written down. The law was as much custom and memory as it was rule and record. In this world, accusation was often enough to begin the descent into confinement. Sometimes a priest made the charge, sometimes a merchant, a neighbour, or a passing noble. Once accused, a person had little choice. They might protest, but few resisted. To resist was to invite harsher punishment or to appear guilty. Most simply lowered their eyes, followed the escort, and hoped for understanding or mercy. Initial holding places varied. In some towns, the accused were kept in the guardhouse or in a small, damp chamber beneath a church. In others, they were sent directly to the town jail, a place where the days were long and the future uncertain. There they waited. No one told them how long. There were no schedules, no expected dates, just waiting as days dissolved into one another. The formal process of judgment moved slowly. Lords might be away for weeks. Traveling judges often dealt with dozens of cases in a single visit, listening to them one after another in hastily convened courts. The church, when involved, might demand a confession. But confession could be encouraged by subtle threats or by the simple knowledge that a cell was always ready for those who held back. Some trials were little more than performances. A clerk read charges aloud, a few witnesses spoke. The accused was given a moment to respond, sometimes in Latin, a language few understood. Verdicts came swiftly. Guilt was common. Innocence rare. And even when innocence was granted, freedom could still be delayed, tangled in bureaucracy or the pride of a wronged official. In some cases, the method of proof was cruel. Ordeals, ancient tests of truth, were still practiced. A man might be ordered to carry a hot iron or plunge his hand into boiling water, under the belief that divine intervention would spare the innocent from harm. Such rituals did not serve truth, they served control. And all the while, the prisoner waited. In the dim quiet of a stone room, they replayed the moment of arrest again and again, wondering what they had done or why they had been chosen. In time, the memory faded, replaced by the routine of stillness, of meals without taste, of sleep without rest. In the medieval world, justice was not always about right and wrong. It was a matter of power, reputation, and timing. And once caught in its path, a prisoner's only certainty was the cell itself, the cold stone, the dim light, and the long, uncounted hours of waiting. Morning in the prison did not come with song or sunlight. It crept in quietly, unnoticed by most. A faint change in the colour of the stone, a pale wash of light slipping down the wall, the soft sound of movement far away. These were the only signs that another day had begun. The air remained cool, the walls still damp, and the rhythm of confinement began again. The cell was a world reduced to essentials: stone, straw, and silence. Most cells measured little more than a few paces across, with ceilings low enough to stoop beneath. A wooden bench or a pile of straw served as a bed. If the prisoner was lucky, a scrap of cloth or blanket was provided, though it was rarely clean or warm. The floor was often packed dirt or rough-hewn stone that soaked up cold like a sponge. Meals were delivered at irregular times, and they offered little comfort: a hard crust of bread, a bowl of thin broth, a cup of water from a shared bucket. These were the staples. Occasionally, a turnip or piece of salted meat might appear, usually thanks to a bribe or a sympathetic jailer. Hunger was not always severe, but it was constant. It dulled the senses and made time pass even more slowly. There were no books, no tools, no diversions. Days stretched long and unbroken. Some prisoners carved marks into the stone, one line for each passing day, though it was easy to lose count. Others whispered prayers, recited stories remembered from childhood, or simply stared at the same patch of wall until their eyes blurred. A few talked to themselves, softly at first, then louder as the weeks wore on. Latrines were crude if present at all: a bucket in the corner, a hole in the floor. Whatever means were provided, they were rarely cleaned with care. The smell hung in the air, settling into clothing and skin. Washing was infrequent. A pail of cold water might be provided, but it was often not enough. Cleanliness became a memory, replaced by a constant sense of discomfort and the persistent itch of filth. Insects and rodents were familiar companions. Mice scurried through the straw at night. Fleas nestled in bedding. Flies hovered near waste. The prisoners grew used to these small presences, sometimes even finding them oddly comforting. A rat gnawing in the corner was a reminder that something still moved, that life continued in some form, even in confinement. Not all moments were entirely grim. Occasionally, a guard might share a word, a joke, or a bit of news from outside. These small interactions meant much. They were reminders that a world still existed beyond the walls, a world with sun, sky, and voices. For some prisoners, these fleeting connections were the most precious part of the day. But mostly, life in the cell was marked by sameness. The same air, the same food, the same stillness. Hours passed without urgency, days melted into one another. And in that endless sameness, the prisoner's mind began to change, becoming quieter, slower, more inward. Thought became a private companion. Memory turned into a refuge. In the stillness of that space, time became soft. And in that soft time, the prisoner learned to exist with less, to breathe in silence, to live within limits, and to wait without knowing what for. He arrived early, long before the town stirred. The gaoler, keeper of keys, steps, and silence. His presence was not grand or cruel, simply constant. As the prisoners marked their days by the soft glow of the window slit, the gaoler marked his by the weight of the keyring at his side, and the routine of his footsteps across stone. He did not wear armour or finery. His clothes were thick, practical woolen, dark with use and the dull traces of oil and iron. His boots echoed through the corridors, steady and slow, the sound familiar to all who waited behind the doors. When he passed, no one called out. No one begged or pleaded, unless it was necessary. The gaoler was not there to listen, he was there to maintain order, to move quietly between lives kept still. Each key on his ring was for a different door, a different life. He knew them all by feel and sound. He turned locks without thought, the metal catching and releasing with a practiced motion. A flick of the wrist, a creak of the hinge, a mutter under his breath, then silence once more. The gaoler was not always harsh. Some were indifferent, performing their tasks with the same attention a farmer might give to feeding hens. Others were more watchful, more present. A few, rare and often tired, showed flashes of kindness. A pause to share a word, a piece of bread left just a little fresher, a blanket passed without being asked. These moments were never promised and seldom spoken of, but they were remembered. He saw much. Faces as they arrived, angry, confused, resigned. Faces as they changed, sickened, quieted, aged by weeks of stillness. Some prisoners wept, others stared. A few spoke too much, filling the cell with noise until their voices broke. The gaoler heard it all, and though he seldom reacted, he remembered, not always the names, but the sounds, the faces, the long silences between. At times, he sat near the outer door, sharpening a blade or mending a strap. He watched the light fade, he drank from a tin cup. If asked, he might say nothing, or he might speak briefly of the weather, the markets, the latest rumour from the edge of town. It depended on the day, on the weight of the keys. In the quiet hours of the night, the gaoler made his rounds with a lantern, its warm glow brushing across the cold stone. He did not rush, there was no need. Time moved slowly here, he had learned to move with it. Some prisoners feared him, others saw him as part of the stone, unchanging, impassive. A few even grew to rely on him, not for mercy, but for routine, for the simple act of arrival, the knowledge that someone would come each morning and each evening, without fail. And when a prisoner was led away, freed, judged, or taken to another fate, it was the gaoler who opened the door, who watched them take that first step beyond the walls. Not with joy, not with sorrow, just the turning of another key, the closing of another door. In the prison, silence was not an absence, it was a presence. It filled the spaces between stones, settled into the folds of straw, and curled softly around each breath. It was not total. There were sounds, small and scattered, like faint ripples in still water, but the silence held its place, stretching wide and deep, shaping the hours with invisible hands. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, slow and measured. The jailer's boots moved with the steadiness of a clock, the jingle of his keys a soft reminder that the world still turned. At times, voices murmured, low conversations between guards, brief instructions or the occasional sigh. These sounds, however fleeting, broke the stillness without disturbing it. They came and went, like wind through trees, leaving silence to settle once more. Inside the cells, the quiet was different. It was personal. It pressed gently on the mind and body. A prisoner might shift in place and hear the rustle of straw, the creak of wood beneath their weight, or the scrape of a toe against stone. They might clear their throat, whisper a prayer, or hum softly under their breath. These were not distractions, they were anchors, small affirmations of presence in a place designed to erase time. Rats scurried along the walls, their claws tapping faintly in the dark. Insects buzzed, water dripped, sometimes slowly, sometimes in erratic bursts. The wind slipped in through cracks, moaning like a distant voice. Together, these sounds formed a quiet orchestra, uninvited, unnoticed by most, but deeply familiar to those who spent their days and nights in the cell's cold embrace. Occasionally, sound came in bursts, a distant shout, a door slammed shut, the clang of metal as a chain was dropped or lifted. These noises startled, not because they were loud, but because they were rare. They reminded the prisoner that something still moved beyond their immediate world, that others still walked, still spoke, still acted. Some prisoners spoke to themselves. Words offered shape to thought, gave motion to stillness. They recited verses, told stories, named things in the dark. Others sang, low, slow songs from childhood or chapel. The voice became a companion, a soft presence in a place where human contact had grown thin. But even those who filled the quiet with words would pause. Silence always returned. It was patient, it did not demand, and in time, many learned to welcome it. For in silence, something else emerged, a deep, interior stillness. The noise of memory, fear, and longing softened. The mind, once restless, grew calm. The body, bound by stone, found rhythm in stillness. Thought stretched out like a thread through the dark, drifting freely across past and future, then curling back to the present moment. In this space of soft quiet, a prisoner did not vanish. They became more deeply themselves, shaped not by sound, but by what was left in its absence. Within the cold stone walls of the medieval prison, illness was not a stranger. It was a quiet companion, drifting through corridors, settling into corners, and resting in the breath of those already weakened by hunger and stillness. It came without announcement, first as a chill, a cough, a wince of pain, and it often lingered longer than hope. The air was damp, moisture crept along the stone, especially in winter. The straw that covered the floor was rarely dry, often reused and quickly soiled. Blankets, when offered, were thin and shared between many. Clothes, worn without change for weeks or longer, became stiff with sweat and filth. In such conditions, even the healthy grew weary, and the weary soon grew sick. There were no physicians in the prison, no apothecaries with jars of herbs or skilled hands to examine the sick. Treatment came, if at all, in fragments. A guard might toss in an extra cup of water. A fellow prisoner might share a crust of bread or a folded piece of cloth, dampened from the same water used for washing. Care was not organized. It was instinctive, makeshift, human. Fever was common. It arrived slowly, warming the skin, clouding the mind. A sick prisoner might lie for days, wrapped in their own arms, lips dry, breath shallow. Some whispered prayers. Others stared at the ceiling, unmoving. No one came to take their temperature or offer rest. The sick were simply left where they were, their illness watched only by the occasional rat or the fading light from the wall. Some prisoners recovered. They emerged from illness thinner, quieter, and changed. Their movements slowed, their eyes more distant. Others did not recover. Death, in the prison, came as gently as sleep. The body would still, the breath would slow, and at last cease altogether. No cries, no rituals, only the silence that followed. When a prisoner died, a jailer would take the body away, wrapped in cloth or nothing at all. Sometimes a name was recorded, sometimes not. The dead were buried in simple pits outside the walls, without marker, without prayer, unless a priest happened to be nearby. Their absence left no gap. The cell was soon filled again, as the world beyond continued to move, unbothered by the loss. Among prisoners, care for the sick was quiet and unspoken. One might share a sip of water, another might sit close, offering warmth. There were no expectations, no rewards, just small gestures in the face of suffering, and these gestures, though humble, carried meaning. In the dark, a hand held, a word spoken, a shared silence. These things reminded the ill that they were still human, still seen. Health in the prison was not a state of strength but of endurance. It meant waking each day without new pain. It meant keeping breath steady, limbs warm, skin intact. To be healthy was to survive another day, and for many, that was enough. In the dim corridors of confinement, where care came from strangers and healing came slowly, illness revealed something deeper, a shared vulnerability. Even in silence, even in suffering, prisoners reached toward one another, quietly, gently, and in those moments, life held on. In the prison, time moved differently. It did not pass with bells or hourglasses, nor with the rhythms of work and rest known to those outside the walls. There were no seasons marked by planting or harvest, no feast days to break the year into parts. Instead, time stretched long and thin, unmarked, uninterrupted, and unchanged. Prisoners marked time in small, quiet ways. Some scratched lines into the stone, one mark for each day, though soon the count was lost and the lines blurred together. Others watched the patch of light that crept across the wall from the narrow window high above. It moved slowly, predictably, from one side to the other and then vanished again. That was morning. That was night. The days felt longer in the cell, not because they were truly longer, but because they lacked shape. There were no tasks to complete, no journeys to begin, no moments to distinguish one hour from the next. Hunger came and went, sleep arrived unpredictably. A prisoner might nap for a few minutes or drift in and out of slumber for hours, unsure of whether it was day or night. The mind began to bend around this quiet, constant stretch of time. Memories softened at the edges, some became sharper, visited again and again, an image of a field, a voice long gone, a warm room filled with laughter. Others faded entirely, like pages worn smooth by too many readings. Time, once measured by events and milestones, became something else, something internal, without clear beginning or end. Seasons could still be felt, even if unseen. In winter, the stone walls grew colder, breath became visible, and fingers stiffened with the chill. In summer, the air grew stale and thick, heavy with the scent of sweat and damp straw. Spring brought new scents from the world beyond, fresh earth, distant rain. Autumn hinted at change, though none came. These shifts reminded the prisoner that the world still turned, even if they no longer moved with it. For some, time was a burden. Each hour felt like a stone added to the weight already carried. For others, it became a kind of balm, an endless pool of stillness into which thoughts could drift and disappear. There were no deadlines, no pressures, only existence, measured not by tasks but by breath. In time, the prisoner adjusted. The days no longer felt long. They simply were. A routine formed, not in action, but in being. Wake, sit, think, eat, sleep, repeat. There was no rush, no urgency. Even pain became a kind of rhythm, expected and understood. The silence between thoughts grew longer, like the pause between waves. And so time passed, not in leaps or surges, but in slow, silent folds, one moment, then another. No fanfare, no witness, just the soft, steady flow of life, continuing inside stone. In this timelessness, the prisoner did not forget who they were, but they became something quieter, a life reduced to breath and thought, resting gently in the arms of waiting. Within the quiet confines of the medieval prison, companionship was rare, but never impossible. Though walls divided cell from cell and silence cloaked each corridor, human presence still lingered. It moved in small ways, passed from one soul to another through quiet gestures, soft voices, and the simple comfort of knowing someone else breathed nearby. Some cells held more than one prisoner. In these shared spaces, two strangers might sit side by side for weeks or months, learning to live in tandem. They moved carefully, making space without asking. They listened to each other's sighs, groans, or restless shifting in the night. Words came slowly at first, shaped by caution, then became more familiar. Names were exchanged, stories followed, and sometimes silence returned, not out of tension but understanding. In cells that stood alone, companionship came in different forms. A voice might carry faintly through the stone, barely heard but deeply appreciated. A prisoner might hum, and another respond with a verse. These quiet exchanges, held between cracks in the wall or gaps beneath doors, became lifelines, invisible threads that stitched one soul to another. Some found companionship in the living world around them, mice that scurried at their feet, spiders that spun delicate webs in corners, birds that sometimes called from outside. These small lives offered comfort, their presence a reminder that movement still existed beyond the cell. A rat was not an enemy, it was something to watch, to greet, to observe as days unfolded slowly in stillness. There were moments of kindness, too. A prisoner might share a crust of bread or offer a sip of water. They might pass along a scrap of cloth to warm cold fingers or whisper a prayer over a sick companion. These were not grand acts, but they mattered deeply. They were the touch points of humanity in a place built to strip it away. And yet, loneliness was always near. It waited in the corners, crept in during the long hours when nothing moved. It was especially sharp at night, when even the gaoler's footsteps had faded and the wind whispered through cracks in the stone. In these hours, the prisoner sat alone with thought, sometimes painful, sometimes distant, sometimes numb. For those held in isolation, the loneliness became something physical. It settled into the chest, pressed behind the eyes. Some prisoners spoke aloud just to hear their own voice. Others recited memories, imagined conversations, or whispered to loved ones far away. The act of speaking created the illusion of presence, and that illusion was enough to carry them through. There was no cure for loneliness in prison, but there was resilience. The heart, even when quieted by time and sorrow, sought connection, and it often found it, in a glance, a word, a rhythm of breathing shared with another in the dark. Judgment, when it came, arrived not with thunder or drama, but with quiet formality. The door opened, and the prisoner was summoned. There was no warning, no preparation, just the soft voice of the gaoler or the creak of the key in the lock. For days, weeks, or months, the prisoner had waited, unsure if the day would come at all. And then, without ceremony, it had arrived. The walk from the cell to the place of judgment was often brief, but heavy with thought. The prisoner passed familiar stones, flickering torches, and the eyes of others who watched in silence. No words were spoken, no promises made. At the end of the corridor, a room stood ready. Sometimes it was a hall in the castle, sometimes a corner of the church, and sometimes a tent if the court travelled with the local lord. The court itself varied. In small towns, a local reeve or steward presided. In larger matters, a nobleman, sheriff, or church official sat in judgment. A clerk or scribe might be present to record the proceedings, dipping a quill into ink as words were spoken. There were no juries, no advocates. The accused stood alone. Charges were read aloud. Some prisoners understood them, others did not. Latin was common in formal courts, and many of the accused could not read or write. Testimonies were given by witnesses, sometimes true, sometimes twisted by fear, memory, or personal grudge. The prisoner was asked to respond. A nod, a denial, a trembling voice trying to explain. The sentence, when delivered, came swiftly. There were no long deliberations. Punishments varied depending on the charge, the judge, and the mood of the day. A thief might be fined, branded, or ordered to serve a term. A debt might result in continued imprisonment until payment came. More serious accusations could lead to public punishment or worse. Some judgments were final: execution for repeat offences, exile for threats to order, or consignment to a deeper part of the prison, beyond the reach of light. Others offered hope, release after time served, a transfer to another place, or the chance to work off one's sentence through labour. But in all cases, the moment of sentencing left its mark. It was an end to uncertainty, but rarely a source of peace. The prisoner was then led away, sometimes back to the cell, sometimes to another fate. There was no applause, no acknowledgement, just the steady steps of return, the sound of the key turning once more, and the silence that followed. Judgment in the medieval world was not always about truth. It was about order, expectation, and authority. Mercy appeared now and then, but it was never owed, and so the prisoner learned to accept what came, to endure the outcome as they had endured the waiting. In that solemn room, beneath the gaze of figures who held power over freedom and fate, a life was measured and reshaped, not with compassion, and not always with cruelty, simply with finality. For some, the prison gates opened again. Not in chains, not under sentence, but with the quiet freedom of release. It came without fanfare. There was no crowd, no ceremony, just a guard unlocking the door, a nod from the jailer, and the simple instruction: go. Sometimes the prisoner was told of their release a day in advance. Often they found out only when the key turned in the lock, and they were told to rise. Stepping beyond the threshold was not as easy as it seemed. The air outside felt different, wider, colder, richer with sound. For months or years, the prisoner had lived inside stone. Their eyes had adjusted to shadows, their ears to silence. The brightness of day, the wind on their face, the scent of the earth, it overwhelmed them. Some wept, some smiled faintly, others walked slowly, uncertain whether they were truly free. Clothing was returned, if it had been kept. Often it no longer fit. It hung loose over lean shoulders or pinched against new scars. A few prisoners were given cloaks or shoes from the jail's storage, worn by many before them. Possessions, if held, were passed back, a pendant, a knife, a letter, but many left with nothing. The world outside had not waited. Loved ones might have moved on, homes could be lost, children grown. A prisoner returned to a life unfamiliar. Towns had changed, faces aged. Sometimes even their own name had been forgotten in the stories people told. Rejoining the world meant starting again, quietly, patiently, and often alone. For others, freedom was not granted, it was taken. Escape was rare but not impossible, a loose brick, a rotted door frame, a guard distracted or persuaded. These moments came without warning and vanished quickly. Most who attempted escape failed, but a few, those with courage, cunning, or sheer luck, made it to the outer wall and beyond. Escape required silence and resolve. The prisoner had to move like smoke, without trace. They crawled through narrow gaps, crept across courtyards, and ran without looking back. If caught, the punishment was swift. Lashes, extended sentence, or worse. But for those who vanished into the forest or slipped away on footpaths known only to villagers, escape became a second chance. Whether release came through mercy or effort, the prison remained behind, etched into memory, carried in posture, in breath, in the rhythm of thought. The prisoner was free, yes, but changed. The silence of the cell echoed in their mind. The simplicity of stone stayed in their bones. Some returned to work, others wandered, a few entered monasteries drawn by the quiet, and some did not speak of their time at all, holding it close like a fragile flame that could not be named. The gate closed behind them. The road stretched ahead. The world waited, though it had moved on. And the prisoner, now a former prisoner, walked forward into a life shaped by what they had endured in stillness. Not all prisoners were released. Some never faced judgment, nor received word of sentence or pardon. They were the ones left behind, those who slipped through the cracks of memory and process. Their names were written once in a ledger, perhaps, then lost to time. They remained in their cells, growing quieter with each passing day, until even the gaoler barely registered their presence. These forgotten souls did not arrive with great crimes. Many were poor, a travelling worker who lacked the correct papers, a woman accused of witchcraft by fearful neighbours, a debt unpaid during a hard winter. Some were swept up in raids or unrest, arrested with little cause and never formally tried. The reasons faded quickly, and in the stillness of the prison they faded too. They asked at first, they called out, they waited by the door. But as weeks turned to months and no answers came, their voices softened. Questions became fewer, words became whispers. then silence. Their world shrank until it included only their own body, the four walls around them, and the thoughts that circled slowly like smoke in a sealed room. Others in the prison knew they were there. Sometimes they shared scraps, spoke through the walls, offered comfort. But over time, even these connections waned. New prisoners came and went. Guards changed, ledgers were rewritten, and the forgotten remained. No longer seen as people, but as part of the stone. Some scratched messages on the walls, names, dates, prayers. These markings outlived them. Visitors in later years might find a name carved in a dark corner, barely legible. No one knew who the person was, only that they had lived, waited, and likely died without witness. The prison itself did not mourn, it absorbed their passing without a tremble. A jailer might remove the body and fill the cell again in time, or not. Sometimes the cell remained empty, unused out of superstition or neglect. Dust collected, light dimmed, and the silence returned, as it always did. These prisoners were not remembered by monuments or stories, but they had lived. They had breathed and hoped. Their thoughts, however quiet, had moved through time. And even in the forgetting, something of them remained. Etched into the stone, whispered in the air, held faintly in the memory of a place that had known so many. In thinking of them, one does not feel despair, but humility, for in each forgotten life is a reflection, a reminder of how easily a person can vanish from record, but still matter in truth. How fragile notice is, how strong the human presence, even when no one is looking. And so they remain, not gone, but quiet, waiting not for freedom, but for someone, someday, to remember that they had once been here. The prison, long after its last door closed and its final footstep faded, remained. Its walls, weathered by time, stood as a quiet monument to lives once lived within. Moss softened its edges, ivy crept along its cracks, rain darkened the stone. Yet the building did not crumble. It endured, as if time itself bowed slightly in acknowledgement of its years of silence and memory. Some prisons were repurposed, turned into storage, stables, or granaries. Others stood empty, their rooms hollow and echoing. A few were forgotten entirely, overgrown by woods or swallowed by earth, reduced to stone outlines visible only to those who knew where to look. But even those in ruins held presence, a weight in the air, a stillness that lingered. Visitors sometimes came, a traveller passing through, a local child daring to look inside, a historian with parchment in hand, eager to trace the outlines of lives long gone. They spoke in whispers, unsure why. The building asked for reverence without words. Its walls did not tell stories aloud, but they offered impressions, shadows of sound, memory caught in stone. Inside, remnants remained. A chain fastened to a wall, rusted with age. Scratches on stone, initials lost to time. The faint trace of footsteps worn into the floor. A patch of wall where heat once rose from a hearth. These quiet artifacts did not name names, but they spoke of presence, of days filled with breath, movement, thought. The prison had held hundreds, perhaps more. Some had left, others had not. All had lived out chapters of their lives between those walls. Their voices no longer echoed, but their stillness had settled into the very shape of the place. It was not haunted by fear or anger. It was filled with memory, wrapped gently in silence. The world had changed. Justice had grown more complex. Rights were written, courts reformed. Prisons evolved into institutions with clocks, schedules, and rules. Yet in essence, confinement remained. A space between one life and another. A pause, a stillness. And this old prison, long empty, still held that shape, a place designed for waiting. To stand within it, even in decay, was to feel that time, not as a rush or a storm, but as a breath held in stone. The air hung differently, sounds were muffled, one's own footsteps felt louder, and the mind quieted, as if listening for something. The stone did not speak, it never had, but it remembered, And in that remembering, every life once held within it, every cry, whisper, breath, and silence was honoured, not with monuments but with endurance, with the simple fact that the prison remained.